Sarah's life was a constant battle, one she fought every single day with a determination that could move mountains, even when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. She was a single mom to 2 young kids, barely getting by in a small, rundown apartment that always seemed to need fixing. The walls were thin, the heater worked only half the time, and the sound of her neighbors arguing was a constant reminder that she wasn't alone in her struggles. Yet she pressed on, driven by the love she had for her children and the unshakable hope that one day, things would get better. Her mornings started before the sun even thought about rising. At 5 a.m., the alarm would blare. Cutting through the precious few hours of sleep, she managed to get after her late-night shifts. "Time to get up, kiddos," she'd say softly, nudging her son, Alex, and daughter Mia awake. They'd groan in protest, but Sarah always managed to coax them out of bed with a mix of gentle prodding and promises of pancakes. Though most mornings it was just cereal. As the kids ate breakfast, she'd hurriedly pack their lunches, the contents varying depending on what she could afford that week. Peanut butter sandwiches on a good week, just bread and butter on the tougher ones. "I'm sorry, sweeties," she'd whisper to herself, guilt gnawing at her. But there wasn't time to dwell. She had a bus to catch. Her first job was at a local diner, where she worked as a waitress during the breakfast rush. The uniform was worn and a size too small, but she didn't have the money to replace it. Customers ranged from grumpy to downright rude, and while the tips helped, they were never enough to make a real dent in her mounting bills. "Sarah, table 5 needs their check," her manager barked one morning, snapping her out of her thoughts. She forced a smile and hurried to the table, her feet already aching just 2 hours into her shift. By the time her first job ended, she barely had time to grab a quick bite herself before heading to her second job at a call center, where she answered customer complaints for 8 more grueling hours. Every evening, she'd return home utterly drained, her body begging for rest, but her responsibilities far from over. There were dinners to make, homework to help with, and bedtime stories to read. Despite her exhaustion, Sarah made it a point to never let her kids see how much she was struggling. "Everything's going to be okay," she'd tell them, her voice steady even when her heart was breaking. But things weren't okay. Her financial situation was dire. The bills seemed to multiply every month: rent, utilities, childcare. And then there were the unexpected expenses, like when Mia needed new shoes for school, or when Alex got sick and needed medicine. Worst of all was the car. Her old sedan had broken down months ago, and the cost of repairs was more than she made in a month. Without it, she was forced to rely on buses, which were often late or overcrowded. The daily commute was a nightmare, adding hours to her already packed schedule. Yet there was no other option. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at a pile of unpaid bills, the weight of it all hit her like a tidal wave. Tears streamed down her face as she cradled her head in her hands. "How much longer can I keep this up?" she wondered aloud. But even in her darkest moments, Sarah refused to give up. She couldn't afford to. The hardest part wasn't the physical exhaustion, or even the financial stress. It was the guilt. Guilt that her kids were missing out on a childhood free of worry. Guilt that she couldn't give them more. Guilt that no matter how hard she worked, it never seemed to be enough. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Alex asked one night, his big, innocent eyes searching hers for reassurance. "Of course we are," she replied, forcing a smile. "Because we have each other. And that's all we need." Despite her efforts to shield them, Sarah knew her kids felt the weight of their circumstances. They were too young to fully understand, but old enough to notice when the fridge was emptier than usual, or when she skipped dinner so they could eat. Still, Sarah held on to hope, even when it felt like she was clutching at straws. She believed in the power of hard work and kindness, even as life seemed determined to test her faith. Little did she know, the universe had a plan. A twist of fate that would take her from the depths of despair to a place she'd never dared to dream of. Her chance encounter with Richard was just around the corner. But at that moment, as she folded laundry late into the night with heavy eyes and a heavier heart, she had no idea how close she was to the turning point of her life. The day had started like any other, exhausting and relentless. Sarah was already feeling the weight of her schedule before she even finished her second cup of coffee. She had barely caught a moment's breath when she kissed her kids goodbye and rushed out the door, mentally preparing herself for the 2-hour bus ride to her second job. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of the mounting bills and the growing list of things she still couldn't afford. How am I going to make it through this week? She thought, shaking her head as she pulled on her worn jacket. By the time she finished her shift at the call center, Sarah's feet ached, and her eyes felt like they were made of lead. She was tired, so tired that every step toward her car felt like dragging her body through quicksand. Yet as always, she had to push forward. There was no time to dwell on how tired she felt. The kids would be waiting for her, and the chores and responsibilities were endless. She climbed into her old sedan, the worn leather seats creaking under her weight. The engine sputtered as she turned the key, and for a moment, she wondered if today would be the day it finally gave up on her. But it started, albeit with a cough, and Sarah breathed a sigh of relief. She just needed to make it home. Nothing more, nothing less. As she navigated through the winding streets, she tried to shake the exhaustion from her bones. The rhythmic hum of the car's engine was soothing in its own way. But just as she rounded the corner onto a quiet stretch of road, she saw it. A sleek, black luxury car, its hazard lights flashing, stranded on the side of the road. For a moment, Sarah thought about driving right past it. After all, who could afford to stop for strangers when you're barely scraping by yourself? She was already late, her body aching for rest, and the thought of stopping filled her with reluctance. But something inside her stirred, a voice, a reminder of who she was. You can't leave him there, she thought. It wasn't in her nature to turn a blind eye. Even with all the struggles of her own life, Sarah still believed in helping others when she could. She couldn't explain why, but the thought of passing by someone in need didn't sit well with her. She hesitated for only a second, before pulling over to the side of the road. Her heart was already pounding in her chest, but she pushed the fear aside. This wasn't about her. This wasn't about her exhaustion or her problems. This was about someone else, someone who needed help. She got out of her car, shivering slightly as the cool evening air hit her skin. As she approached the man standing by the car, she could see the frustration and worry etched on his face. He was well-dressed, a man who clearly didn't belong on the side of a quiet road with a broken-down car. He looked out of place. The man turned at the sound of her footsteps, his eyes narrowing as he looked her up and down, probably assessing whether she was someone who could help. His gaze softened when he saw the determination in her eyes, and for a brief moment, they simply stared at each other. His expensive suit seemed to contrast sharply with the mess of his situation. He wasn't supposed to be stuck here like this. He looked like someone who had people to take care of these things for him. Can I help you? Sarah asked, her voice steady though her heart raced. The man let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders. My car broke down, and I'm supposed to be at an important meeting. I don't know what to do. His voice trailed off, frustration creeping in again. Sarah glanced at the car. It was a luxury vehicle, one that gleamed in the fading light of the day. The kind of car she only saw in magazines or on TV. She felt a pang of envy but quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't about her. I'm not a mechanic, Sarah said, glancing at him apologetically. But I can take a look and see what might be wrong. She didn't know anything about luxury cars. Heck, she could barely keep her own car running. But she couldn't just leave him stranded. The man's eyes flickered with surprise before he nodded. Anything helps, he said, his tone more resigned than hopeful. As they both crouched beside the car, Sarah tried to keep her focus on the task at hand. It wasn't easy. The thought of how much she longed to get home and rest gnawed at her. But she pushed it aside. There was something in the man's demeanor, his vulnerability, that made her want to help. I'm Sarah, she said after a few minutes, trying to break the awkward silence. Richard, the man replied, his voice softening. Richard Westbrook. Nice to meet you, Richard, she said, feeling the strange tension in the air lift just a little. They worked in silence for a few more moments, each of them assessing the situation. Richard seemed grateful, even if he didn't show it outright. His posture had softened, and his earlier frustration seemed to dissipate as he realized Sarah wasn't going to leave him hanging. It was clear that Richard was more than just a businessman. He had a sense of responsibility, a need to make things right. And as they worked together, Sarah began to see a different side of him. A side that wasn't so much about the wealth and power that surrounded him, but the human struggle he too faced. For a few minutes, they both managed to fix the car. Just enough for it to start, though it wasn't going to last long. Still, Richard's expression brightened as the engine roared to life. And for the first time since she met him, Sarah saw him smile. "Thank you," Richard said, his voice sincere. "I honestly don't know what I would have done without you. I can't explain how much this means to me." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that caught her off guard. "You've done more for me today than anyone ever has. I want to repay you, more than just saying thank you." Sarah blinked, taken aback. "Repay me? I just did what anyone would do," she said, shaking her head. But Richard wasn't done. "I want to offer you something more," he said, his voice steady but filled with promise. "I can offer you a job. A real opportunity. You've shown me kindness when I needed it most. And I think you have what it takes to do something more than just survive. What do you say?" For a moment Sarah couldn't speak. The weight of his words hung in the air like a dream too big to grasp. "A job," she repeated, barely believing her ears. Richard smiled again. "A chance to change everything." The engine hummed, sputtered, then roared back to life. Richard let out a breath of relief, and Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her hands still gripping the hood of the car. The air felt thick, almost too heavy. Something had shifted. She couldn't pinpoint when or why, but the tension between them had melted, replaced by an unspoken understanding. They had worked together, strangers, just moments ago. And somehow, against all odds, they had fixed something broken. Richard looked at her, his eyes narrowing, as if he were searching for something. "You know, I've met countless people in my life. Businessmen, CEOs, high-profile executives, you name it," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "But I've never met someone like you. Someone who would stop everything and help a complete stranger. You didn't even know me, and still, you put aside your own problems to help me." He stepped back, as if the weight of what he was saying was too much to hold on to in that small space between them. Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. She'd helped him, yes, but she hadn't expected anything in return. No one had ever looked at her like that. Like she was more than just a woman struggling to make ends meet. I didn't do anything special," she stammered, her voice shaking slightly. I saw you needed help. I'm sure anyone would have done the same thing." Richard shook his head, his lips tightening, as if he were considering his next words carefully. "No, not anyone would have. Trust me, most people would have just driven right by. But you didn't." His voice dropped barely above a whisper. "I owe you more than a thank you." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The air felt thick, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought she might be dreaming. This couldn't be real. A man like him offering her anything more than just a polite nod of gratitude? It didn't make sense. "I'm serious, Sarah," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that nearly took her breath away. "I don't just want to say thank you. I want to offer you something more. Something real." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean more?" I don't understand." Richard's expression softened, his eyes filled with something unreadable, almost as though he were trying to convince himself as much as her. He leaned in, lowering his voice even further, until she had to strain to hear him. "I've been in your position before," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Not exactly, but I've struggled. I've been at the bottom with nothing. And I know how hard it is to get out. But you helped me when you had nothing to gain. And I think you deserve better. You deserve more." Sarah's heart raced. This was too much. Too much for a woman like her. She'd spent so long convincing herself she was invisible in this world, that people like Richard Westbrook, people with money, power, and influence, would never look twice at someone like her. But here he was, staring at her like she was the most important person in the world. "I can't accept that," she said, the words slipping from her mouth before she even fully realized what she was saying. "I've got enough problems of my own, Richard. A job, a real opportunity. I don't even know what you're offering. I'm not someone who belongs in that world. I can't be what you think I am." The words hung in the air, heavy and filled with self-doubt. She could feel the weight of her own inadequacies creeping back in. She wasn't that person. She wasn't special. She was just a single mom trying to survive, and all the glitz and glamour of Richard's world, his polished suit, his extravagant car, was a reminder of just how far out of reach she felt. Richard seemed unfazed, his gaze unwavering. "What if you could be, Sarah?" he asked, his voice so calm, it sent a shiver down her spine. "What if I'm offering you a chance to step into something bigger than you ever imagined? A chance to change your life, your family's future, and prove that you are more than just surviving. You've got what it takes. You just don't know it yet." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She couldn't think straight. What was he really offering her? Was this a real opportunity? Or was it some elaborate joke? A rich man's way of making himself feel better by offering a desperate woman a false hope? "Why me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why would you offer me a job? Someone like you. Someone who's so successful, so far above what I could ever be. Why would you even bother?" Richard's eyes softened as he took a step back, crossing his arms. "Because I've seen something in you, Sarah. It's not about money or status. It's about your heart. You showed me kindness when I needed it, and that's not something you find every day. You have more potential than you realize. I can help you tap into that. But the choice is yours. All I'm asking is that you consider it." The silence between them felt suffocating, as though the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for her to decide. She looked at him, unsure of what to believe. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? For a moment, all Sarah could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Could she really walk away from everything she knew? Could she take the risk and step into a world that felt so foreign, so out of reach? But then something inside her stirred. A spark of hope, a tiny flicker of possibility. "What do I have to lose?" she thought almost out loud. "What if this is the one chance I've been waiting for my whole life?" Before she could answer herself, Richard spoke again, his voice steady. "I'll give you time to think about it, Sarah. No pressure. But remember, sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most rewarding outcomes." The weight of his words settled in her chest, and as she looked at him, something shifted in her. Maybe it wasn't about whether she was worthy of the opportunity. Maybe it was about taking a chance for once, about trusting in herself, and the possibility of a future she could never have dreamed of. In that moment, Sarah's life changed forever. What began as a simple act of kindness blossomed into an opportunity she never thought possible. She'd taken a leap of faith, not just in Richard, but in herself. Was it the right choice? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, she would no longer let doubt hold her back. Sometimes it's not about waiting for the perfect moment. It's about seizing the chance when it comes. And who knows? Maybe the next life-changing moment is just around the corner for all of us. What would you do if that moment arrived?